I will never forget the night my phone whispered that message into the dark and made the whole world tilt. It was a cold October evening in the parking lot of a grocery store in Queens, and I thought, at first, it was a spam alert. I was where I always was at that time, sleep-deprived and clinging to a coffee and a list of errands, and the air smelled like rain and roasted peanuts from the vendor across the street. At the moment the alert popped up, my chest dropped and a slow ice crawled along my spine. I found out then that a tiny piece of technology could quietly map every step I took and turn my ordinary routes into a map for someone else. I am telling 3 true, terrifying tales tonight about Apple Airtag tracking and what happened to me and people I know. And I promise to take you from the first small sign through the escalation and into the legal and emotional consequences so that you can see how ordinary life can be invaded and what you can do if it happens to you. My name is Emma, and this happened to me, to my friend Sarah, and to someone I had never met until the police called her a witness. And by the end, you will understand how small objects can create big fear. Have you ever gotten a notification that you were being followed? What would you do if it happened 3 times in a row? I grew up in a crowded house on 31st Street, where my father, Mark, taught me to always lock the door and check the peephole twice. My mother, Julia, kept a bowl of keys by the sink and told stories about people who left doors unlocked and paid for it later. As a kid, I was quietly curious and cautious. I studied urban planning in college because I loved maps and patterns. And my first job was in logistics, where I tracked shipments for a living, which made the idea of invisible tracking both strangely familiar and deeply threatening. My 20s were a series of small losses that taught me to be practical. Losing friends to moves, losing my first apartment to mold, losing a relationship that convinced me I could survive calm and loneliness. Those losses left me careful about trust and obsessive about routines. When I turned 30, I moved to a different neighborhood and started driving to see my sister Elena more often. And that sense of routine is precisely what I later realized could make you visible to the wrong person. I remember lying awake at night in my old apartment and listening to the heater click, thinking those sounds were normal. Later, I would learn to read every creak as a possible sign. My backstory is not dramatic in the way movies promise. It is ordinary and patrolled by habits that I thought were safe until they were not. First tale began that October night at the grocery store, where the alert read, "Tracking detected moving with you." I pulled into the dim lot under an orange streetlight, the smell of wet asphalt and frying oil undercutting the mundane hum of traffic, and I clicked on the notification with hands that shook. I remember the texture of my jacket sleeve under my fingers and the taste of cold coffee. I looked around, saw Tom across the lot locking his car and waving at someone on his phone, saw a mother tugging a stroller, saw nothing that explained the message. I whispered, to no one in particular, "This cannot be real," and then I heard my own voice sound small. I walked back to the curb and ran my fingers through my bag, feeling for anything odd, and feeling, at the same time, a heat of shame like I should have noticed earlier. I called Sarah and left a clipped message, and she answered on the second ring. "What do you mean, tracking detected?" she asked. "It says an AirTag may be with you," I said, and she inhaled audibly. "Get home and check everything," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made me dizzy with gratitude and terror. That small exchange was the first domino. Inside my apartment, the air was warm with the smell of old takeout containers and lemon cleaner. I emptied my bag on the kitchen table and moved every wrapper as if the thing would be a theatrical reveal. I found a tiny round object under a receipt, cold and metallic and smaller than a coin. I remember the shock of its coolness against my palm, the way my pulse hammered in the pads of my fingers. I had a brief, ridiculous thought that it might be a lost coin or a promotional token, and then I scanned the device with my phone and the same message came back. I called Officer Ramirez at the local precinct and left a message explaining the alert. "If it is an AirTag," he said when he called back, "we will document it as evidence, but you should not touch or move it more than necessary." His tone was procedural and calm, and that steadiness helped for a moment. I wrapped the device in a napkin and put it in a shoebox. I wrote down the time, the place I had been, and the sequence of things I had done that day, and I texted my friend Alex, "Found it in my bag." He replied with a string of exclamation points and said he would come over. The first moment of real tension came as I waited for Alex to arrive. I sat on the couch, the lamp throwing a small circle of light on the coffee table, and listened for sounds in the hallway. I could feel my skin prickling. The smell of cleaner suddenly made the apartment feel clinical and exposed. I heard footsteps outside, and my heart narrowed. When I opened the door, it was only Maria from the building, carrying her groceries. I exhaled audibly and closed the door, but the relief did not last. That creeping, tight fear is hard to describe. It is not alarm, but a patient, invasive anxiety that sits behind your ribs. This moment of tension lasted minutes, but felt much longer. And it taught me that an object the size of a coin could make your own spaces feel rented. When Alex arrived, he was practical in a way I needed. He took pictures of the device, logged the serial number, and said things out loud so I would not sink into dread. "We need a record," he said. "We will go to the precinct or call them here." I insisted on staying put because walking outside felt unsafe. There was a conversation with 5 to 7 exchanges between Alex, me, and the officer on the phone that night, which I remember in fragments because the fear made the words bright and sharp. I said, "Will they come now?" And Alex said, "They are on their way." And I asked, "What if he is watching the building?" And Alex said, "Then we stay inside and let the police handle it." And I said, "I do not want to press charges without proof." And he said, "We press a complaint and let forensic examine it." And the officer said, "Bring it to the station, we will log it and run a trace." Those exchanges accounted for each step I later followed, and they showed me how the social scaffolding of friends and police can take urgency and make it processable. The procedural explanation I was given by Officer Ramirez and later by Detective Patel was concise and calming. When an Airtag is reported, you document the device, photograph it, log the serial number and the time of discovery, and submit it to the evidence room, where chain of custody is maintained and forensic teams check any fingerprints or DNA and then ask for device data from the manufacturer through a legal request. This process protects the evidence and creates the paper trail needed for a complaint. That explanation was about 300 characters in my notes, and it made the next steps feel possible. The escalation in the second tale began when my friend Sarah, who I had called earlier, found a similar device hidden in the lining of the glove compartment of her car 3 weeks later. Her scene was different and therefore more chilling. She was parked outside her office in Manhattan, the city sounds a distant bass that day, and the smell of exhaust mixed with perfume when she reached to get her keys. Her hands brushed fabric and then metal, and the knowledge that something small had been there with her daily commute made her stomach drop. There was a moment of disbelief, then anger, then a meticulous search of the car. She pulled out the device and called her partner Tom. "I do not want you to panic," she told him, but her voice trembled. He arrived with a toolbox and a calm face and said, "We will document everything and not touch anything you want untouched." They had a longer conversation with the building security manager, Luis, who walked the lot cameras with them and reviewed the footage. Luis said, "I will flag any plates that look familiar." And he then called Elena, who had once worked nights on the security desk. Elena watched footage and sent a clip in which a blurred figure lingered near Sarah's car on 3 separate days. The sensorial details of that day are etched. The oily smell of the parking garage, the faint taste of metal from the car vent, the gritty feel of the device when Sarah pressed it into a napkin. That search and the camera review amplified the feeling that someone had studied her routine. A moment of high tension unfolded in that garage when the security footage appeared to show a person matching the outline of a neighbor who had always been polite in the elevator. Sarah confronted him at the elevator, and the conversation had many exchanges, more than 5, and each was edged with accusation and disbelief. She said, "Did you plant a device in my car?" And he replied, "No, what are you saying?" And she said, "My Airtag alerted me." And he said, "I do not even know what that is." And she said, "Elena saw you near my car." And he said, "You are making this up." And she said, "We have footage." And he said, "Then show it to me in front of management." And the exchange drew a small crowd of neighbors who watched and murmured. That crowd's reaction included Julia, who texted me, Mark, who stood with his arms crossed and hissed, "This is not okay," and Dr. Morales, who called later to say that she would testify if needed because she had observed suspicious behavior in the lobby. The neighbor's denial and the bystander's interest created a social pressure that felt both comforting and like a risk, because a confrontation can provoke unpredictable responses. The second tale took on a pattern. After the glove compartment discovery, Sarah changed her routines. She installed new locks and started parking in a different spot. And she slept with the feeling that someone might be mapping her day. She started to avoid certain coffee shops that she knew were on her path. And that sense of shrinking is exactly what stalking does. She told me, "I am careful now of directions I used to take without thinking. And the sensory details of the change are sharp. Footsteps that used to be background became loud. Doors closing sounded menacing. And even the smell of a bakery near her office made her wonder if someone had been watching her through the window." My third tale was the most legally complicated, and it involved a stranger named Alex who I had met only at a community group and who later became a focal point. In this incident, the device was found taped inside a library book and left on my desk at work in Brooklyn. The scene was absurd and intimate. The smell of paper and glue, a faint dust on my fingertips, and then the surprise of a small metallic circle under the book jacket. I opened it at lunch to scan my reading list, and there it was. I felt violated in a way different from the car or the bag. This was work and a place I associated with quiet focus. I confronted a colleague named Daniel first because he had been near my desk that morning. The conversation that followed was tense and long, with 5 to 7 exchanges. I said, "Did you bring this book to my desk?" And he said, "No, I did not." And I said, "Someone planted an Airtag inside it." And he said, "Why would you think that?" And I said, "Because it beeped on my phone." And he said, "We should call security." And I said, "We should call the police." And he said, "Are you sure you want this public?" And I said, "I need a record." That debate showed the precariousness of making something visible legally when workplace reputations and privacy are involved. Detective Patel took the report and opened an inquiry that unfolded into a legal tangle. There were witness statements from Elena, Luis, Maria, Tom, and Dr. Morales, and evidence logged by Officer Ramirez. The police explained the steps: forensic exam of the device, request to Apple for owner information, subpoenas if necessary, and a careful chain of custody so that the device and any prints or DNA could be admissible. The technical description was not long, but it mattered for credibility. The device was logged, photographed, packaged, and entered into evidence under a protocol number. And any data request required a formal legal process, which officers described as necessary to obtain owner registration from the manufacturer. That process took time and left us vulnerable in the meantime. The big legal conflict formed when the person identified by the precinct as associated with one of the devices denied any wrongdoing and enlisted a lawyer named Rebecca who argued there was no direct proof that he had placed the device intentionally. The courtroom exchanges were sharp, and the hearing felt like another kind of public exposure. My testimony, Sarah's, Elena's, and Luis's were all made into transcripts, and there were cross-examinations from the defense. The prosecution framed a narrative of pattern and intent, and the defense argued coincidence and misassociation. The psychological weight of that conflict settled on me in a heavy lump that interfered with sleep and with the ability to eat normally. I developed insomnia and brief panic spells where I felt a drowning sensation in the middle of the day and had to call Mark or Julia to ground myself. The tension here is not only legal but existential. The larger conflict asked whether small devices mean big threats, and whether the law could keep pace. There were 3 distinct moments of tension during this legal battle that I remember in vivid detail. The first was the day Detective Patel brought the preliminary report to my kitchen table. The report contained photos and a tentative connection to a license plate. I remember sitting at the table with the lamp warm on my face, smelling cold coffee and paper, and hearing Detective Patel say, "We have something, but not enough." I felt both hope and an odd exposure, because evidence also meant testimony, and testimony meant retelling the invasion. The second moment came when the defense called a witness who suggested the footage was unclear and that routine proximity did not equal intent. The courtroom felt like airless theater, and the smell of old varnish from the wooden bench made my throat tighten. The third moment of tension was after a late-night message was sent anonymously to my phone, quoting a private detail only the person who had been at my desk could have known. That message arrived at midnight, and the screen light made the room feel like a stage. Each of these moments lasted long in memory, and about 5 minutes in the moment, but added up to a sense of being pursued in time. Throughout these episodes, I named more people than I could count. Mark, my father, who came to hearings and sat with stoic anger. Julia, my mother, who called every morning to check on me. Alex, who photographed and logged evidence. Elena, who reviewed footage and testified. Luis, the security manager, who pulled camera clips. Tom, Sarah's partner, who fortified her car. Maria, the neighbor, who almost became a witness by chance. Dr. Morales, who offered to speak about community patterns and who later referred us to a therapist. Officer Ramirez, who documented the items, and Detective Patel, who led the investigation. And Rebecca, the defense attorney, who mounted the legal challenge. Each person had agency and a reaction, and each reaction shaped the path of the case. They all helped in small and large ways, and sometimes their help complicated things because testimony invites scrutiny. About 1/3 of this narrative, I want to pause and talk directly to you. If you felt a chill listening to any of this, I understand. I felt the same cold, sinking feeling when my phone first informed me that I might be followed. This is not just a story, it is a moment that calls for conversation. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized someone might be watching you or tracking you? If so, please share in the comments. Start your reply with yes, when, and tell us briefly what happened. If you have never experienced this but it makes you worried, start with never but, and say what you would do. Your experience or your question could help someone else who is silently trying to make sense of a strange notification or a found device. When you share, you help build a community that recognizes patterns and supports action. You are not alone, and by exchanging details, we can help each other decide whether to call the police, to document evidence, to change routines, or to seek legal counsel. Now, back to the story and to how the investigation and the court hearing unfolded. The courtroom sequences were long, and the legal proceedings slow and granular. The prosecution presented the chain of custody records and forensic notes, the screenshots of notification logs from my phone, and the statements from surveillance. The defense tried to cast doubt on the link from device to person and aimed to show there was reasonable doubt about intent. I sat on the witness stand and felt the fluorescent light press down, smelled old coffee from the witness room, and tasted copper in my mouth. The judge listened and sometimes asked clarifying questions. In that legal drama, our small city system tried to decide if the pattern met the threshold for harassment and whether the chain of evidence satisfied the standard for a warrant to compel data from the device owner. The procedural explanation I received earlier about chain of custody mattered here, because without it, evidence could be dismissed. This part of the story was technical and exhausting and required a lawyer to explain subtleties to me in plain language. One outcome was that police were able to get owner information from Apple after legal steps, and that led to an arrest of the person associated with one device. In that arrest, they found items that connected to multiple scenes, and the precinct charged him with stalking and unlawful surveillance. The legal phase had consequences beyond the courtroom. Friends who had been willing to testify faced uncomfortable questions at work. Neighbors who had been helpful felt drained, and my sense of privacy was permanently altered. The person arrested had a backstory that the defense tried to introduce to mitigate his actions. He had a job in facilities and a complicated past with mental health issues, which the defense argued made his behavior non-criminal. We were given a portrait by the court files that tried to show context, not excuse. And the prosecution framed the case around intent and repeated behavior. Those back and forths reminded me that the legal system balances evidence with motives and that outcomes are rarely simple. I will not pretend that the aftermath was tidy. I experienced months of insomnia and a heightened state of vigilance. I stopped leaving my keys visible, I changed how I carried my bag, and I wrote down every odd message and every time a stranger seemed to be where I expected solitude. The psychological toll included several weeks where I felt a constant low-level panic, and I started therapy with Dr. Morales, who helped me develop grounding techniques and reassess the degree of change I wanted to make in my life. The therapy sessions were a lifeline. She helped me name the emotions and reclaim small freedoms, like walking a certain block without scanning the horizon. 1 month later, I had already made procedural and practical changes that felt stabilizing. I switched routines, I logged the devices I found with dates and times, and I started carrying a printed list of emergency contacts in my wallet. I met with Officer Ramirez and Detective Patel to follow up and provided additional testimony about small patterns I had missed earlier. I went to a hearing where community members like Luis and Elena appeared to strengthen the case with video evidence. The immediate shock had eased and was replaced by a weary vigilance. I remember the small sensory details of that month, the crispness of the fall air as I walked to the precinct, the smell of institutional coffee in the waiting area, the roughness of the paper subpoenas I signed. I had good days and bad days, and on good days I practiced normal morning routines like brewing coffee with the radio on, and on bad days I rechecked locks 3 times. 3 months later, there was a different kind of progress and a lingering exhaustion. The person linked to at least one device had been arraigned, and the prosecution had assembled a fuller narrative. I had more legal clarity and less immediate fear because the courts provided a structure that at least tried to assign responsibility. I continued therapy and started attending a support group that Dr. Morales recommended, where other people who had experienced stalking shared tips and gave emotional support. I felt less alone. The minor rituals I had adopted became more habitual. I no longer always took the same route to the grocery store, and I varied times and patterns as a precaution. The sensory memory had deepened. The whir of an elevator now made me notice who entered. A notification ping raised my heart, but no longer pushed me into a spiral. I worked with Alex and Alina to lock down an online profile that had inadvertently revealed travel routines. In legal terms, the process was slow, but it moved forward. The defendant pleaded not guilty, and the case was set for trial. There were hearings and motions, and the need to rehash the invasion at every step was draining. I learned that prosecution is as much endurance as it is law. 6 months later, I had a different relationship to fear. The person associated with multiple devices had been convicted on several counts after the jury heard testimony about pattern and intent, and the evidence chain held up. The verdict brought relief and did not remove all trauma, but it marked a boundary. The aftermath of the conviction included the person being ordered to register and to stay away from me and from others who had been affected. I kept therapy and continued to meet with my community group. I also began to volunteer with an online forum to help others understand how to document incidents and how to approach law enforcement. The sensory details now include spring air when I can walk without scanning the sky, the soft, papery rustle of court packets filed away, and the distant hum of an urban life that feels, most days, like mine again. I reflect on what I lost and what I gained. I lost some innocence and the ability to take my route through the city for granted. And I gained a vocabulary to name invasion and a community that pushed me toward action. If you are watching and worried about your safety, here are some practical lessons I learned without giving harmful instructions. If your phone notifies you of a tracker, do not ignore it. Document the discovery with photos, note times and locations, do not willingly move the device more than necessary for safety, and contact local police to file a report. Keep records of communications, ask friends to be witnesses, and preserve any camera footage you can access. For technical evidence, the police may request information from the manufacturer through legal channels, and that typically requires a warrant or formal request, so working with officers is important. Seek medical or psychological support if you find your sleep and daily functioning affected. These steps emphasize safety and legal process, not exploitation of technology. In the end, the smallest object taught me about the fragility of routine and the importance of community. I do not want to end on fear, but on a cautious hope. 1 month after the verdict, I could walk past the library where the book had been left with less adrenaline surging through my limbs. 3 months later, I helped Sarah move to a new apartment, and we laughed in a way that felt like repair. 6 months later, I still check my bag and sometimes feel a flicker of suspicion, but I also feel stronger and less alone. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing your experience in the comments and subscribe for more accounts that mix personal narrative with practical guidance so we can learn from each other and build safer routines. Remember that an alert on your phone does not need to become a secret shame. It can be a first step toward evidence and toward protection and toward reclaiming the spaces you keep for yourself.